Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another video about the Persona series where, a while back, I did a retrospective for Persona 5, one of my all-time favorite games, with the intention of eventually playing Personas 3 and 4, making videos on those, though, again, never got around to it until we obviously got a remake of Persona 3, Persona 3 Reload, which I finally got around to playing way after it initially came out. And again, here I'll be talking about my entire experience with the game, talking about my thoughts with the game along the way. And again, to give context, again, I am pretty much one of those people that really got into the series of Persona 5, tapped my foot into Persona 4 when I was younger, a while back, did not get particularly deep into it. However, Persona 5 was the game that, again, I played when it came out and absolutely adored, it being one of my favorite games of all time. And in the time since then, I've always wanted to go and, again, play these other Persona games, and this remake was the perfect opportunity to do so. And while Persona 3, again, on paper, is very similar to Persona 5, and having a very similar gameplay loop, I did actually come out of my early days playing Persona 3 actually being a bit disappointed by it, mainly in the fact that it isn't Persona 5. That, again, while, again, it is the same on paper, there's so many things that Persona 5 does that Persona 3 doesn't do. And because of that, again, I was enjoying Persona 3, but I was not loving Persona 3. But at the point that I'm at now, where obviously I've finished the game, I've actually watched other people play the game, I've done a lot of research into the game, I could say now, I really adore Persona 3. And I think in my heart of hearts, I truly do believe Persona 3 is better than Persona 5. Where, again, Persona 5, I think, again, is a great game still. And I have so much attachment to that game and its characters. I feel like Persona 3 feels like there's more purpose to it. It feels like this game that has these very well-defined themes and, again, executes it perfectly from a narrative perspective, but then also ties all that to its gameplay in an extremely satisfying way. I think there's a lot of aspects of Persona 3 that feel so integral to the core experience that, again, are used again in Persona 5, but in that game feel like they're simply just there because they're in Persona 3. And I do think Persona 3 as a whole is a much tighter, focused experience, and at this point I could say one of my favorite games of all time. Now, I should mention that, again, I've only played the Reload version. Now, again, I've done research into the previous versions of the game, but I've not actually played those at this point. And despite the fact that I do really like Reload as a product, I can understand the criticisms for Reload as a product, where I do think Reload is a game that, again, as much as I do still really like it, I do understand the criticisms that they essentially tried to make Persona 3 more like Persona 5. Again, there are these gameplay additions that are made here that simply feel like they're added here for the sake of making it more like Persona 5, the game that, again, more people have played. And again, I can definitely get that criticism, and especially in how it strips away from the game's original message. And while that is a criticism that, again, I think I would have if I played the original, even playing Persona 3 as is on the remake was still a really great experience. Now, again, we're going to be running through my overall thoughts on the game, running through my experience with the game, where let's start off with the game's opening, where right away you could tell how much darker of a tone this game has from Persona 5, and us getting this opening cutscene of what we later learn to be one of the main characters in Yukari pointing a gun at her head and struggling to actually shoot, which, again, obviously implies self-harm when you're originally watching this, though in retrospect, it's obviously the way they awaken their personas, which is actually kind of insane. That's how they do it in this game, but also so thematically satisfying at the same time. Again, essentially being representative of your lack of fear of death, and that really playing into the major theme of this game. But again, the first bit of gameplay that we get here is us playing as the main protagonist as he heads to his dorm for the first time, during which we walk through his streets with it being very, very green, which, again, I know that's a criticism of the remake here of how green everything is during the dark hour. But I do like this introduction here, and first introducing us to these locations that we'll be going to quite often. But obviously, we eventually arrive at Iwo Todai dorm, which ends up being our home/base for the entire game here. But it's obviously here where we get introduced to Eros, this creepy little boy that ends up watching us as we sleep, that we end up building a social link with, though obviously he ends up playing a much bigger role down the road. Also meeting up with Yukari and Mitsuru, who also live in the dorm, who obviously end up being party members and very much on the offset come off as very generic anime style characters, though they obviously get more depth down the road. Where at this point, Yukari just comes off as the traditional girl next door that you initially have a frosty relationship with, though that eventually grows. While Mitsuru obviously is the, again, stern leader figure. They eventually get to come out of her shell. Here we also end up getting our first day at school, meeting Junpei, who just comes off as another version of Ryuji. Now, again, technically Ryuji's another version of Junpei. But again, from my personal experience, having no experience with Persona 3, obviously I did draw that parallel, even though, again, I feel like their characters end up being a bit different by the end of it. But again, initially we do play out what, again, ends up being the typical Persona formula. Now, technically, again, this was the first game to have this calendar system, which, again, obviously I've already been accustomed to in Persona 5, though I feel like this is actually a game that, again, utilizes the calendar system even better. It gives there a major thematic reason for it existing, where, again, the calendar system was, again, created for this game. It was the first game to ever utilize it, and I think you can very much tell in the fact that, again, in a game that its entire thematic message is making the most about life and not fearing death, again, having this calendar system where you play out every single day for almost an entire year, it really makes you appreciate each of those days. It makes you feel that passage of time and make you feel more appreciative for the time that's gone by, to where, again, I do think the utilization of the calendar system in this game is very effective in further connecting itself to the themes of the game, which is something that, again, I don't think Persona 5 does as well, even though it's, again, still a fun mechanic that they end up keeping for down the road. But obviously here we get introduced to social stats, which were handled a bit differently here than in Persona 5. I feel like in Persona 5 it was a lot more difficult to max out your social stats, yet here there's only 3 of them. It's academics, charm, and courage, with charm and courage being fairly easy to max out relatively early on in the story, all while academics, again, was a bit more of a pain, though you still can easily get it before the last few months. And to be fair, I mean, maxing out these social stats ends up meaning a bit more for down the road, where, I mean, your social links with certain party members are not able to be unlocked until you max out these social stats, where, again, it makes maxing them out earlier something even more integral. But it was a change here that I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but it does leave it kind of weird in the fact that throughout the back portion of the game, you're more than likely going to be maxed out already, to where you still have to go through these classroom sessions and can do these activities to gain these skill points that don't ultimately matter, though, to be honest, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as we'll later talk about. Now, along the way here, we finally do start to progress the plot a little bit by meeting Ikutsuki, the chairman of the board of their school, also a creepy mother effer who was very clearly an antagonist from the very beginning, something I called the instant I saw him. Obviously, the game doesn't want to know that right away, but it is also here where we get an introduction to the Velvet Room, obviously this trope within all these Persona games, where after a while, obviously allow you to fuse personas, and again, a lot of that just plays out pretty similarly how Persona 5 operates. But eventually, we do get to our first dark hour, where we learn our fellow dormmate in Akihiko Sanada ends up being injured while trying to fight a shadow alone, leading to a tutorial sequence here where we get our first battle of the game, where we obviously get the main protagonist using an invoker on his head, being able to call out his persona. Obviously a big moment for any Persona game, this first awakening, though at the same time, I do think this is actually a moment that, having watched the original, feels a lot more impactful, where here it just feels a little bit more subdued for my taste, and giving us our first taste of the turn-based gameplay, which again, goes as expected. Again, I feel like in terms of the raw gameplay of it all, a lot of it's just, again, more of what you would expect from Persona 5. Now, I know there were things that were in the original Persona 3 that were taken out of this game. Many of those things feeling like things that were a bit more tedious than not, particularly in how there's like a fatigue system, and the fact that you actually could not control your own party members, which, again, I'm happy are out of this version for the sake of gameplay, as I think it makes an easier gameplay experience. However, I do think it does take away from the game thematically. Again, I think there is a reason why those things were in the game, particularly, again, the ability to not control your own party members and only, again, guide what they do, again, I think is a very important system to the overall themes of the game, and the fact that these party members, again, are their own people. They're not just these characters in a video game that you have full control over. Again, they have their own thoughts and ways they want to do things, and while, again, from a gameplay perspective, it is very annoying, as, again, that means that you're really dependent on AI to help you in situations. And again, I do think it makes the gameplay experience better to not have to deal with that, but it does, again, take away from what the message of this game was. Following this first encounter, we do awaken in the hospital with Yukari by our bedside in a spot where I do feel like the game very much implies that Yukari is the one that you're meant to have as your love interest, where while obviously this is a game where by the end of it you can romance a wide range of social links, I do feel like the beginning of the story, particularly like the first 2/3 of this game, feels so focused on Yukari in a spot where it does feel like Yukari's a bit of a like second main character to this game, to where, again, I do feel like it feels like Yukari is this character that you're meant to end up romancing, though obviously the romances don't even end up really playing a factor into the story much at all. But again, it is here where we do learn about her background, the fact that her father died working in a lab for the Kirijo group, which surely won't end up being brought up again down the road. But following this, we do get a new party member to join our group, who ends up being Junpei. What a shocker. Though I do find it very strange how this game handles the introduction of party members, where they're just kind of thrown at you at points, where just out of the blue, Ikutsuki will come to you and say, hey, this person's joining your crew and now living in your dorm. And again, I feel like that's very strange. But again, I do think it plays into the story pretty well. And the fact that, again, this is not a group of friends. This is simply just a group of people being forced to work together. So again, I know there is a lot of criticism over how Persona 3 and Persona 5, their characters feel like co-workers more so than friends. And while I do think with Persona 5, that's a more fair criticism, where it feels like everything kind of revolves around the main character. You don't really see many interactions with anyone else. This is a game where, again, that's kind of the point, where, again, they're not meant to like each other until deeper into the game, where, again, those bonds end up forging, and you do see them a bit more in a friendly manner by the end. And also, I do think this game handles the relationships between the other party members very well. Again, I do feel like we see a lot of scenes that involve the other party members interacting outside of the main character, where I do feel like this is a game that does a lot to try to make its party members feel like real people that have their own agendas outside of their bond with the main character, which I do think is a criticism of Persona 5 looking back on it, that, again, I do think this game ends up handling a lot better. But anyway, with Junpei in our group, we now have 3 party members, taking us to our first proper Dark Hour section, where we end up finally going to Tartarus, this game's dungeon. Again, very reminiscent to that of Mementos and Persona 5, though handled very differently. And I feel like that was an aspect of this game that I was initially let down by. The fact that in Persona 5, obviously, there is Mementos, which is this dungeon that you have to complete by the end of the game. But really, those are not the main dungeons in the game. Again, there are these palaces that you have to complete along the way that have, again, essentially these like mini arcs around them, which I do think is something that is lacking in Persona 3. The fact that it does feel like the first like 2/3 of this game doesn't really have much plot progression, where, again, we have this entire goal of having to take down these 12 shadows to supposedly end the Dark Hour and save the world, all while we explore Tartarus along the way. Again, this big dungeon that, again, we eventually get to the top of by the end of the game. But there isn't any other true dungeon along the way. Again, there are these boss battles at the times of these full moons, but again, there really aren't these like palaces in this game. And again, to me, that came off as initially disappointing. I think in retrospect, I don't really mind it personally. And again, not as a criticism of Persona 5, where I think Persona 5 handles those very well in that specific game. I feel like this game doesn't really need that, though. And I feel like taking out those palaces in this game allows for there to be a lot more focus on the social link aspect of the game, which at the end of the day is really the core of this game. But again, our initial visit to Tartarus here ends up being very tutorial focused, again, introducing us to the turn-based combat, the exploration around Tartarus, which, again, I initially thought would be very tedious, though I kind of grew accustomed to it by the end, and I did actually enjoy the Tartarus sections, even though I do feel like it's probably a thing of, like, again, probably more enjoyable in this game than they are in the original, where, again, originally there was this fatigue system, which, to be fair, again, I think there are reasons for that, again, as, again, it forces you to break up your Tartarus sections into smaller chunks, which, again, excuses why there's not as much to do at nighttime, as, again, you're meant to be playing Tartarus more often at nighttime, where, again, I know that is a criticism, that there's not as much to do in the nighttime portions of the game, and I do feel like that's probably more so due to the original game being balanced a bit better than Persona 3 Reload here, but even then, I think there is a little bit of reason towards that, especially towards the back portion of the game. Anyway, after this, we get introduced to police station, where we buy weapons, because I guess that's the thing you could do from a police station. And at this point, we can really explore Tartarus at our own pace, which is something that I do like. Now, again, at points, there are going to be border rooms that stop you from progressing, because, again, they don't want you to complete all of Tartarus in one go, though you don't actually need to go to Tartarus, really up until the end of the game. Now, again, there is the end goal of getting the good ending, which to do that, you do need to reach the end of Tartarus. But again, it's something that you don't need to do in most situations, where really it's like outside of the tutorial sections. And again, there eventually being a point that if you don't go to Tartarus relatively early on, that Mitsuru will force you to go at a point. But really outside that, you don't really have to progress in Tartarus at all throughout the majority of the game, which is something I do very much like. I like that added freedom there, that if you were to just say screw it, you could just not do any of Tartarus until the tail end of the game. You know, obviously at that point it would be very monotonous to go through over 200 floors all in one night. But again, I do like that added level of freedom there. But to be honest, we do finally get introduced to social links in the game through Tomochika's social link, which was a weird one, revolving around him thinking that his teacher is into him, and him really bragging about that to us, which is, again, very weird. social link, especially considering it ends up culminating in the fact that and it not really being true and Kenji just being completely misguided. But again, I find it very funny that this is the initial social link we're introduced to in this game. But again, the social link system is really where this game really shines. As again, I really love what they do with it here. Again, they really end up attaching it to the themes of the game in a really satisfying way. In that through these social links, we obviously have the main character affecting all these people's lives, where each of these characters are people that are seemingly running away from something, people that have these fears that they need to overcome, people that aren't living their lives to the fullest. And through that, we have our main character allowing these people to figure out what they want to do with their lives and reach their full potential. And again, fully playing into the themes of this story. And that's something that I really do love from this game and how well it connects these social links to really the overarching theme of the entire story. But eventually I do end up also starting the Boon Kichi and Mutsoko social link, which I've never said their names out loud in my entire life before. But again, this elderly couple that had lost their son, and this ends up being a very touching story about the loss of their son and wanting something to remember him by, with it culminating in them wanting to grow this persimmon tree and being devastated by the fact that a school is going to be built over it, only to then come to terms that their son would have wanted that because it helps the greater good. And again, I do think that really ties into the themes pretty well. I did very much like their storyline by the end of it. Now, also along the way, we do end up being guided into joining into these different clubs around the school. First up, the student council, which gives us more social links, which is something that this game does in that it kind of forces you into interacting with the social link that ends up spawning into other social links, which I think is an interesting way that this was handled, where I feel like in Persona 5, everything was a lot more individual, where I feel like a lot of social links in this game are with a group of characters that are kind of hovering around each other, a lot of them obviously being schoolmates. And here we end up having our first meetups with, again, a couple people you can have social links with. Otagiri, who's someone that I didn't end up finishing his social link, though. Again, he kind of came off a dick initially. I assume he becomes a better guy by the end. You would hope. Oh, well, there's also Chihiro here, who I also did not finish by the end. I got a bit closer in hers, though. Again, I did really like Chihiro as a character, one that had a lot of insecurities when you first meet her, and again, it seemed like she was kind of growing out of that towards the end of her story. Also along the way, you can start the Maya social link, which is one that's only available on Sundays at home. Of you playing an MMO with a character named Maya, who is having a pretty interesting story here, where it obviously ends up turning out that Maya is actually your homeroom teacher, and she ends up airing out her frustrations, your conversations, in which you're able to get her on the right path by the end and start to grow love for being a teacher. And again, I did really like this arc as well, and it does lead to a really humorous moment at the very end of the game. Also, you can join the track team, during which you meet, again, a couple other characters. You get Miyamoto, a character that I also did not finish his social link, though we do also hear meet Yuko as the team manager, a character that I really liked. Her actually being one of the first characters that I maxed out her social link, actually being someone that I romanced by the end, which, and I kind of regret it a bit, just because obviously it doesn't feel as impactful to romance Yuko as it would be for you to romance one of your fellow party members who you get to know a bit more. Though I did very much like Yuko's character, even though her social link itself is just kind of very average. Now, around the start of May, I did get my courage high enough to where you can enter Club Escapade at night, which does open a new social link, one with Matatsu, a monk who's constantly at the bar drunk. And again, I thought he also had a pretty good social link here, one that has him being estranged from his family, and by the end, through our conversations, he ends up getting back together with his family, which, again, a nice little story there. Who ends up being one of the few social links you can do at night, which definitely made it a lot easier to finish his. It's also around here I started social link with Maiko. Again, another storyline that I very much liked, even though, again, it was a little bit weird, the fact that you're really like bonding with this little kid, and she's asking if you can get married, and then again, it has her wanting to run away, and you can encourage her to, which again, all that's very strange. But again, all this has her coming to terms with her parents' divorce, which again, also felt like it connects to the themes by the end as well. And through Maiko's storyline, we do also get introduced to Akinari, who probably has what ends up being my favorite social link in all of Persona that I've played up to this point. One that just feels so resonant to the themes of this game, and really just ends up having such a bittersweet story of him being a person who's terminally ill and is struggling to write this final story he wants to write before his passing. And by the end, he ends up writing one about an animal whose death ends up leading to the creation of this spring that is able to be enjoyed by the other animals after his death, which again just resonates with the themes of this game extremely well, where Akinori's social link ends up being such a masterfully executed one here. And it's also here where I also started my social link with Sumitsu, who I know is a character that is seemingly hated by a lot of the online fan base, and I don't really understand why. Like, I get it in the sense that, yeah, he does say some dickish things at points, but I do feel like he comes off as a much more humorous character to me, and I feel like by the end, again, I feel like he also has a very good arc as well that connects to the themes through him running away from the trauma from his brother's death and is able to come out the other side by the end. Where I personally think Sumitsu is probably an underrated social link here, though I don't know how much of that was, again, maybe a change from in the Reload version or just the fact that I didn't get as frustrated with certain aspects of his character as much as other people seem to. Eventually, we do get to our first formal dark hour, taking out our first of these shadows, where in most of these situations, it ends up just simply being the boss battle against the shadow we're meant to take down, though this time we get a bit more of an extended sequence, having some battles along the way, going through some subways. So eventually we get to our first major boss here, which is one where they do put a timer above your head to add this added level of urgency to the fight, even though realistically, I feel like a lot of these major boss battles end up being relatively easy, especially if you end up keeping up with your sections in Tartarus along the way, to where as long as you're balancing those out pretty well. Again, I didn't feel like there were many points where there's much struggle to be had with these boss battles, but along the way, we also get introduced to linked episodes, which I believe was new content added here for Reload. Essentially social link episodes of you spending time with the male members of your party, because I guess that's the thing Persona 3 did, is that in the original game, you could only have social links with the female members of your party because you could romance them, and I guess that's the only reason to have social links is for romances, I guess, and I find that to be a strange aspect of the original game, which I believe they end up swapping out in Portable, I believe, though with this again being a remake of the original version, they kept that in, though added in these linked episodes to kind of make it a bit better. And again, some of these were pretty strong, though I'll be honest, I kind of missed out on some of them along the way, particularly a very important set of them. So I feel like most of these end up being pretty strong, really being able to characterize their respective characters pretty well. Now, along the way, as Sonata ends up leaving the hospital, again from his injuries, we end up meeting a new character here, Aragaki, a character that will definitely not be important in the story down the road. So again, here he comes off as kind of just generic loner figure. Again, clearly was going to have some narrative significance down the road. Now, after Sonata ends up leaving the hospital, eventually he ends up joining our party, and kind of at a random time, again, adding to the fact that it just feels like characters are kind of just thrown at us at points. Obviously, with Sonata, that means we now have a full party that we can utilize, where again, we can have 4 party members at a time, and eventually the main story does progress through us investigating into Fuka Yamagishi, who's a girl that has disappeared, leading to a bit of an investigation section, try to learn what happened to her, which leads to us being attacked by a gang, which leads to us obviously getting in trouble, only to be saved by Aragaki, who is finally in the story again, only to not really matter here again. But eventually we end up learning more about her through Natsuki, a girl who Fuka was trying to be friends with, yet she bullied her for some reason, leading to the next full moon sequence where we find out that Fuka is lost in Tartarus and rescuing her from it, leading to a boss battle against the Emperor and Empress Arcanas, which is where Fuka ends up unlocking her persona, with her now becoming our new navigator, which allows Mitsuru to eventually join our party, but also gives us a lot of useful skills with Fuka, being able to scan enemies for weaknesses and giving us boosts along the way, with us also eventually being introduced to the Thurgy system, which is a new addition for Reload that I know has some criticism there, and the fact that it makes the game a lot easier, obviously giving these big special attacks to be used at points, or again, these insane abilities like restoring all your health, or giving these insane buffs, to where, again, I can definitely get that criticism, though, but again, as someone that, again, doesn't particularly love much difficulty in games, I was not particularly bothered by this edition, but I could definitely understand why people think that this made the game a bit too easy. But it's around this time where I did unlock the first of these hangouts with Elizabeth, who is, again, Igor's assistant in the dark room, and someone that gives you requests along the way, aka side quests, that once you complete enough of, you get these very strange sequences of you showing Elizabeth around town, and again, it leads to these like fish out of water moments with her, which again are humorous, though really don't add too much in the grand scheme of things. It's also around this point where we do start to get a lot more to do in the dorm, where again, we unlock things like the kitchen and the roof to allow for us to have these hangouts with our party members at nights, which I don't believe were in the original game. And again, this is another aspect that seems to add more content to at night times, where again, there's kind of a lack of content. But again, these events can get you like special items. And also, if you hang out with certain members for long enough, ends up giving them extra abilities, some of them being pretty insane. Like Yukari's in particular one is pretty insane. The fact that recovery skills only cost 25% of what they should, which again is just insane and definitely helps out in Tartarus, in a spot where again I can get the criticism of that making the game too easy. But again, a lot of these boosts were very well worth it. and does make it feel like you get to know the characters a bit more. Also, here we do unlock these weird videos from Ikutsu's console in the command room that are really just these like weird little character moments of each of our party members that don't really add too much to the story. There are these pretty fun scenes. And around this time, I also got introduced to more social links from the likes of Bebe, who again is this French guy who's obsessed with Japanese culture, and he has these struggles and the fact that his uncle doesn't want him to live in Japan. And again, I thought you had a fine storyline. I didn't end up finishing it. I did get very close. And also here through Fuka, you end up meeting Raga, another social link, who's part of the art club, who, again, his arc was fine. Again, he's one of the social links that I finished. I felt like it was probably one of the least impactful, but again, just one that has his dad wanting him to be a doctor instead of an artist, and by the end, he rejects his father, only to then find out that he has his own separate passion for wanting to be a doctor, where again, it's a fine story, but again, nothing too impactful for me. And it's also around this time that we meet Koromaru, a dog from a nearby shrine, that I wonder if he'll be relevant. Now, along the way, we also get introduced to this antagonistic group in Strega, leaded by Takaya, a group of characters that I did find to be a bit underwhelming by the end, where obviously they do come off very menacing here, again, killing people during the dark hour. And obviously Chidori has her own arc that we'll talk about, but in terms of the main two antagonists in this group, from Takaya and Jin, I did feel like they kind of came off like evil for evil's sake by the end. So while I get their overall perspective of things, I feel like they're characters that really did not seem to do that much outside of just be this like polar opposite ends thematically from our protagonists. And also, be honest, we get introduced to people getting lost in Tartarus, where periodically we have to go and save them, some of which being social links that if you don't end up saving them, their social links end up being erased, which I did not love these missions. I did feel like these missions came off very tedious by the end. Again, very monotonous. Don't really give you that much either. Again, it gives you, again, potentially money or items from the police office after doing it, but at the end of the day, they just felt like more busy work than actual things of substance. But eventually we do get to our third full moon, this one being a very Yukari-centric one, with obviously involving the Lover's Arcana, which is, again, Yukari's Arcana, but again, it has us have this initial boss battle, though following that, we get this more scripted sequence of us being trapped in this hotel room and trying to leave, during which we get a shower sequence with Yukari, because that was necessary. But again, we have to end up finding the right mirror to go through, leading to another boss battle. And all this, again, a very notable sequence. Definitely, again, one of the more expanded upon full moon sequences in the game. But eventually, we do get to a vacation, which has us going on a trip to Mitsuru's family's mansion, which is here where we do get some narrative progression, a little bit more information on what exactly we are doing here, with us meeting Mitsuru's father and him showing us a video of Yukari's father, revealing that he sacrificed himself in an attempt to stop the shadows. And this is a video that obviously ends up propelling the narrative forward, gives us this further incentive to take down these major arcana shadows, even though in retrospect, obviously the presentation of all this does feel very strange. But again, I should have picked up on the fact that not everything here is what it seems. But again, it's fun. Again, we get this great character moment for Yukari, her going out to the beach and having this monologue as the main character follows, with all this playing into the themes of the game, and her struggling to come to terms with her father's death, and us talking about her fears, which she eventually ends up overcoming by the end, where again, I thought this was a great moment for Yukari. Again, one that does very much imply that the game's kind of meant for you to romance her, at least at this point. Following this, we get our typical beach sequence that's seemingly in every Persona game and definitely isn't used for fan service. Again, it ends up leading to a very weird character moment for the men of the group and how they try to hook up with women and all of them failing, which is humorous, leading to a weird scene that I know in the original was just like blatantly transphobic, and that the men meet this woman that they end up being scared off by, and the fact that it turns out it's obviously a trans woman, where again, now they've obviously changed it to be this like weird conspiracy theorist, where obviously again, the original is something that you just simply cannot do in the modern day, while even the new version is something like, I feel like they probably just should have edited all this out. I don't know why any of this needed to be here, but it's along the way that we do end up meeting a new character who's along the beach that ends up clearly being a robot, but that character ends up being Aigis, and we see both Junpei and Akihiko fail at swooning her, only for her to instantly attach herself to the main character. And obviously, Aigis ends up being a pretty major character down the road. Again, this character that really ends up exemplifying the themes of this game. So I did find her character be one that was a bit tough to get into initially, where I didn't really care that much about Aegis during the early portions of the game. It really is not until the last few months of the game where I feel like her character ends up really developing, which I think makes it a bit tough for me in my assessment of Aegis. Is again, I do very much recognize her thematic significance to the story, and I do feel like she is the character that develops the most in a way that, again, fully fits within the themes of the story, but it's also in a way that, again, a lot of that just happened at the tail end, where I felt like through the early portions of this game, I cared so much more about almost every other character over Aegis, where, again, I do feel like it's a bit of a tough thing for me to wrap my head around. But I do feel like this was a solid introduction to Aegis, especially as she obviously ends up joining our party, and ends up being the first to join our party that really primarily focuses around physical attacks, and being pretty useful because of that. But anyway, we do get to our next full moon, where we get our first interaction with Takaya and Jin, with Chihiro not there, so Junpei won't recognize her later, I guess. But this does lead to the next boss battle after running through some dark corridors to face off against a tank, I guess. But it's around here where we get introduced to our next party member, who is Koromaru, the dog from earlier, which was insane to me. The fact that we actually get a dog as an actual party member that uses a persona, which, again, I fully did not know this. Or, again, I knew very little about this game coming into it. The only thing I really knew was people finding Tartarus annoying, and in that there was a character named Aegis. Really, outside that, I knew very little. And through that, finding out that you have a dog as a party member was something that really blew my mind. And, again, I loved Koromaru. I mean, with the addition of Koromaru, you do end up also being able to take him on walks, which can help with your social stats as well. And you can, like, spend a night brushing him. And I did end up really loving having Koromaru as part of your party here. And also not too far from here, we also get introduced to Ken, another character who ends up becoming a party member, who is a 10-year-old kid. And obviously he's initially introduced here before he's a party member, and one that is seemingly just getting to know our group, to which, again, in retrospect, the reasons for him getting close to us is actually a lot more interesting. But again, it did feel a bit weird that we just are randomly hanging around this 10-year-old kid now, and the fact that they actually end up adding him as a party member is kind of insane, as why are we teaming up with a 10-year-old kid to save the world? But either way, we do also get a kind of random sequence along the way of us ending up going home late from a doctor's appointment, leading to us getting attacked by a shadow in the middle of the night, and this leading to us fighting the shadow with Takaya, which was a very strange sequence, which obviously, again, is utilized to, again, get you more acquainted with Takaya, also make Takaya come off as his formidable foe, with him using these overpowered attacks, which, again, felt very in line with, like, how Sephiroth is initially introduced in Final Fantasy VII. Eventually, you get to the Summer Festival, which allows us to pick who we want to hang out with at night, where you could pick Yuko, Chihiro, or Mitsuru, where I did end up picking Mitsuru, mainly because at this point in the story, I was planning on romancing Mitsuru, because I guess it's a little less creepy. Though I was disappointed to see that it's not even like a personal outing here if you pick Mitsuru. It's like you going alongside Aegis, and it's really more so focused on like this like fish out of water content for Aegis, which was a little bit underwhelming from my point of view. But I should mention also the fact here that this is around the time that I started the Tanaka social link, mainly because I did not understand how you started his social link until around this point in the game, where obviously like he had already been introduced through his Tanaka's commodities show, where you can buy items from him every Sunday. But it is at this point where I realized that you actually have to interact with him in your room to activate his social link, during which he proceeds to ask for money, but eventually ends up being a social link that, again, you can interact with no matter what. It'll upgrade no matter what you choose, which I do think I probably would have handled this differently, considering the fact that obviously this is one of those that happens at night, and it's a social link that can go by very quickly. And considering, again, the lack of content at night, I think I would have probably at least switched this one to be one that could at least last a bit longer. But either way, Tanaka's storylines being one that it was fine. I feel like, again, another one of these that was probably on the lower end of my personal rankings of social links. And again, just being Tanaka, giving you advice along the way. And while it does feel like he develops somewhat, not really to any significant degree. So again, not my personal favorite social link, but also along the way, you do get the first moment of Junpei meeting Chidori. Obviously not knowing who she is, that she's part of Strega, but again, this ends up leading to this really endearing relationship between the two that again culminates in one of the biggest moments towards the end of the game. And I think it's something that actually really does elevate Junpei's character, where for me, I felt like he was pretty shallow before this. He was just kind of the typical dumb, humorous at points character, which again, on a surface level, felt very similar to Ryuji from Persona 5. I feel like at this point, I felt like this relationship ends up giving him a bit more depth as we go along. But also here we do get a film festival where we can watch movies with some social links, which I mean realistically doesn't really do that much for the story, but again, just another like nice little touch to add to the fact that it feels like you're living out the individual days of this person's life. But eventually we do see Aegis being admitted into our school and sitting next to us every day. So that's something. Along with the fact that we also have Aragaki joining our party, which again kind of happens at a random time in the game, though again pretty exciting to get Aragaki finally joining our party, the final party member of the game, and one that is extremely powerful in that he has these really overpowered physical attacks that, to be honest, I didn't really use him that much. And also, I did end up neglecting his Link episodes as well, where I did not get the most of Aragaki while I had him, though. I did feel like Aragaki was being set up to be a pretty important character, though not exactly in the way that ends up playing out. But anyway, we get to the next full moon, where we get probably one of the more difficult boss battles with the Arcanas, though. Getting through it, we do get the reveal that Chidori is part of Strega. I never would have guessed. But we end up defeating her, and she ends up being admitted to a hospital where Junpei ends up spending every day with her, because obviously they end up solidifying their bond even more. Now, it is around this point where I did finally max out my courage and charm stats to where I could finally start the social links with Yukari and with Fuka. Fuka, again, having some decent development there, and with her initially wanting to learn how to cook, to fall into these, again, kind of like gender biases, though, ends up coming out of that, realizing that she should really embrace who she is and her love of technology. And again, I did think it was a good arc. Now, I didn't love that it was, again, baked around this trope of, oh my god, a woman can't cook, how funny is that? But again, outside that, I did feel like Fuka's development here was handled decently well. Yukari's arc ends up also being pretty strong, us getting to know more about her relationship with her mother, though I will say I did feel like most of Yukari's development, though, does very much come from the main story, more so than her actual social link. But eventually we get to the next of our full moons on October 4th, and what a day it was, where we first start off with a boss battle against the Fortune Arcana that has, again, this wheel that determines how much damage you take, which is kind of annoying. But during this entire sequence, Ken and Aragaki have gone missing, with the later reveal that Ken has essentially cornered Aragaki and is planning on murdering him, with the reveal that Aragaki is the one that led to Ken's mother's death, with him having lost control of his persona, and that Ken's entire motivations up to this point was him trying to infiltrate the group simply to murder Aragaki, which is a pretty insane backstory for a 10-year-old kid here, but further connecting Ken to the themes of death and, again, finding purpose in life. And it obviously leads to this really great moment of Takaya showing up and proceeds to attempt to kill Ken, only for Aragaki to take the bullet instead, with him sacrificing himself for Ken. Obviously, this person who, again, sought out to murder him, with Aragaki having this very somber death. Right, I was not expecting this. I did not expect Aragaki to die this early on in the story, especially considering how much focus he had beforehand. Obviously, again, I suspected Aragaki would have been integral to the plot of the story, but did not expect it to be in this way, in a spot where initially I did really struggle with what the purpose of this was, though I think in retrospect, it does make a lot of sense to lose Aragaki in this spot. Again, it really ends up highlighting, again, the themes of the story, how Aragaki's death here is one that is really a major blow to our party. I mean, in the sense that obviously Aragaki himself is gone, this character that we could have potentially drawn pretty close to, even though, again, I didn't. But through his death, we do get development for Akihiko and Ken's overall arcs. But also, I did like the little touch of how he was handled in the gameplay as well. As, again, Aragaki is a character that has some of the most overpowered attacks in the game, especially at the point that you end up getting him, to where, again, losing that from your party, again, the most powerful party member, is, again, such a major blow that makes the impact feel even more real here. And again, I do think they do some good work character-wise with him as well after his death, where, again, you can go to his room and get his supplies, during which you can get the reveal that he had actually made the decision to rejoin school before his death, something that Mitsuru had been begging him to do, again, feeling like he was starting to turn his life around, where all this, again, I think is handled so well in the story, and really just emphasizing this more somber tone that Persona 3 ends up having here over Persona 5 in particular. But again, it ends up culminating in the first awakening here, where Sanada ends up coming to terms with Aragaki's death, leading to him awakening his true persona, a spot where these awakenings in Persona 5 were dealt within the social links, though I did actually like how they were handled in this game, probably even more, to where, while I can see the merit of them being done in social links and the fact that obviously that would, again, incentivize you to do their social link, I do think them being handled in the main story makes them feel a lot more integral to the overall plot. It makes it feel like this development here actually matters. Where, again, we end up seeing each of our party members have these awakenings in crucial moments for their stories, with Akihiko getting his first here, along with Ken proceeding to get his after being convinced to stay with the group, both of which being really good moments there. Now, beyond that, I finally start the Hayase social link. On that, I forgot started, and Strip, I got him confused for Hiraga, which is why I never did his social link when it started, and Strip, by that point, I was just kind of like, I don't feel like finishing his when I have so many other social links I'm much more invested in. So yeah, Strip did not do much of Hayase's social link by the end, though it is also around this time where I did end up finishing Yuko's social link, which, again, I end up romancing her by the end in a spot where I mostly did it because I was a bit worried I wasn't going to get to Mitsuru, considering the fact that she unlocked till relatively late into the story. And again, you need to have maxed out academics, which I was relatively far away from getting at this current point, to where I decided to go with Yuko, especially after learning that if you max out social link in this game, you can technically romance as many people as you want without ramifications, which again, they do change in later games, and I think that's probably for the better, but and it made that choice a bit less impactful, the way I was just like, screw it, I'll just romance Yuko for the sake of it at this point. And I mean, to be fair, not really that much is done with the romances in this game outside of just being able to hang out with them during those important dates down the road. Now, also along the way, Fuka ends up having her awakening after Natsuki ends up moving away and talks about how they'll continue to be close, which I mean was probably one of the least consequential awakenings, but I get it happened. With that, we finally get to the next full moon, which is really hyped up as the last operation, with this being the last arcana we have to take down. But this does lead to a pretty extensive boss battle here. First against Takaya and Jin, which ends up being a relatively easy one. I feel like they actually came off very underwhelming considering the fact that they were very much hyped up as these major villains. Following that, we end up getting a much more difficult boss battle against the actual Arcana, which has this ability to call on these like statues to defend itself. Though once defeating it, again, the game's over, the dark hour's done, all the Arcanas are gone, obviously. That is until the next day where we get the reveal that obviously it's not over yet. And now the bigger reveal that Ikutsu's the bad guy. I can't believe it. Who would have guessed that? I definitely didn't from the very beginning. Though again, all this does end up making a lot of sense here, and the fact that it's the reveal that, and he's been lying to us the entire time, that the video that we were shown from Hikari's father ends up being falsified, and that the reality is that destroying the shadows here doesn't end up saving the world, but actually ends up ending it, with actually unleashing the next arcana, which is death, being the end of the world, with again this playing into the overall themes of the story extremely well. Again, the fact that this story is about, again, finding meaning in life and getting over your fear of death, and again for that to be represented here by now facing off against the death arcana and that being the main antagonist of the game, I think is very fitting in that light. Well, also we see again the likes of Ikutsuki, the likes of Strega, as these people that have given up on humanity, these people who have again stopped finding a reason to live, and it feels like the world is better off being destroyed. Again, that ends up playing into the themes very well. Also, the entire notion of there being the apathy syndrome, with a sickness that is going around after the appearance of Tartarus, ends up having these people having this lack of will to live, which again also plays into themes. Again, I just feel like all these things really fit into the themes of the story extremely well. And again, this being this pretty great reveal here, really turning the narrative on its head. And I really do feel like it's from this point forward, I feel like the game really picks up in a spot where, again, up to this point, the plot had been relatively bare bones. Again, it really was us, again, having all these interactions with all these characters, obviously, but really the base plot was really just us taking down these shadows. But it really is once those shadows are defeated where the plot really begins here. And again, this ends up being such a major point for the story, where we do have Ikutsuki capturing us and hanging us on crosses to make that symbolism a lot more obvious. But we do end up having Mitsuru's father coming to rescue us, only for both him and Ikutsuki to shoot each other at the same time, leading to both their deaths, obviously being a big moment for Mitsuru's story. Also, again, just kind of writing Ikutsuki out of the story. Oh, well, Aigis ends up rescuing us instead of killing us as instructed, which again shows her humanity starting to seep out, kind of being the start of her arc here as well. And all this being this very dark moment for the story here, again, putting us in this place of, again, really just unknown in the fact that the world is meant to end coming up. Or again, I just feel like at this point in the game, there are less things to do in the game. And again, I do think that is fully purposeful. As again, obviously this game, again, ends up culminating in you facing off against death. And it feels like at this point, we're essentially waiting for death. And again, it feels like it's playing into the themes of the story. There's this symbolic message in that there's nothing to do here, which kind of adds this sense of dread as you lead up to the final confrontation. But it is also here where, again, we get the awakening for Yukari after watching the undoctored video of her father, with him at the end giving a message to her, which I will say felt a bit cheesy, but again, good progression of her arc, and really kind of the end of her story, where, I mean, obviously we do see some character stuff with her a little bit more down the road, but it does feel like this is kind of the point in the story where Yukari kind of gets thrown to the side a little bit, with Aigis kind of taking her spot instead. Overall, I did feel like this is a very satisfying arc for Yukari. Now, before the next full moon, we do finish up the social link with Pharos, who, again, shows up periodically, and his social link ends up automatically increasing, him being the Death Arcana. I wonder if that'll matter. Which again, he says he's going to disappear after this, which I'm sure he will. But eventually, story continues with us getting a new transfer student in our class, that being Ryoji, who sounds like a grown-up version of Pharos. I wonder why. Or it is pretty obvious what's going on here, where obviously Ryuji shows up immediately after we had defeated all the other shadows, and we get this warning of death coming, to where, again, considering Pharos was the Death Arcana, again, it's pretty apparent what's happening in this spot. But we do get to bond with Ryoji in a spot where I never really cared that much about his character, though I obviously always thought that he was going to end up having some narrative significance down the road. But again, also along the way, we do get some good work with Mitsuru, where we do see a lot of conversations between Yukari and Mitsuru, which eventually ends up leading to her awakening, with her coming to terms with her father's death. But around this time, you can also start her social link, which was, again, kind of another tropey one. Her, again, having an arranged marriage and you helping her get out of it. Again, tropey, but I did finish it. And again, I romance Mitsuru also, which, again, doesn't really go anywhere either. It is here where we also get a school trip, which doesn't really do much for the base plot. I mean, it really is, again, just more bonding with the characters, giving you time to hang out with Ryoji. And we also get a very weird sauna scene with the men getting caught in the sauna while it's the women's time to go, which obviously leads to some weirdness there. But the next big moment happens when Chidori ends up breaking out of the hospital and us getting a scripted boss battle with her. That really is one where you just have to survive long enough. But this ends up leading to one of the strongest moments of the entire game, where Chidori ends up talking about how because of Junpei, she now fears death. And we get a great moment that plays into all the themes of the game once again, of Strega arriving and killing Junpei, which, I mean, in itself, again, I think you could take it at face value, considering the fact that we obviously saw Aragakure get killed, so who knows what they're going to do with Junpei here. But it is here where we do see Chidori sacrificing her life to revive Junpei, and we see their personas fuse. Again, all this was this very touching moment. Again, this great payoff to their relationship that also, again, plays into the themes of Chidori now having lived out her life to help those that she loves. And again, I really did love what they end up doing with her character here, and also with Junpei's character, with him moving on beyond this in a spot where he tries to live for the both of them. Though I do find it a bit weird that he's still like his pervy self after Chidori's death, but either way. The story does obviously progress to the next full moon with a shocking reveal that Ryoji is death. This figure that I guess had fought years ago that she ended up sealing away inside of a nearby boy, I guess, who ends up being the main character. I can't believe it. But again, it's obviously explaining why the main character is special here, and also explains our connection to Pharos as well. And again, I felt like this was handled pretty well here, though Ryuji here ends up defeating Aigis to again set up his threat level, all while getting the reveal that Ryoji is the appraiser of death, this avatar that Nyx is going to take over, which would cause the end of the world. This is where we do get the setup of this important choice that will happen on December 31st. Again, very convenient. But again, a choice that is, again, very thematically satisfying, of being offered to kill Ryoji, and through that, it would wipe their memories of Tartarus, I guess. And through that would allow them to die in peace, not knowing that their end is coming. Or they can decide to not kill him and fight back. Or again, it's very obvious what the themes of the story are telling you which choice you should make, but we do get 28 days to make that choice, as again, we don't have to do it until the 31st. How convenient. During which, again, we obviously get a lot of setup to each of the characters around us wanting to stand up and fight, again, showing the progression of their arcs. So again, we are the ones with the final say, which does end up determining which ending we get. Though first, we do actually get Aigis finally returning after, again, being repaired from her damages with her fight with Ryoji, which we do see her fighting back against our intentions to fight back. But again, this does add to the development of Aigis and her coming to terms with the choice that we made, and again, having an awakening of her own, to which obviously she starts to feel more human here, again, playing into the themes of the story. But again, we get to the 31st where we do make the choice, which again, the game gives you multiple outs here, which I do find humorous, though obviously, again, I picked to go for the good ending here, as I think most people would. To which we get to January 1st, where in this last month of the game, we do have a completely different color palette, which I do really like. And the fact that, again, it just adds this further dread that's coming. Oh, well, again, the music also ends up shifting at this point, which I didn't even talk about the music throughout this game, which again, this is probably one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. But I did really like the shift in music in the last month to be this much more melancholy music, but also with a tinge of hope in it as well, that again is perfectly representative of the situation here. I did also like how the open world changes during this time, where we see a lot more people succumbing to apathy syndrome, and we see the streets getting dirtier. We also get the talk about this cult that's running rampant, which turns out to be run by Takaya, who are all salivating in the end of the world. So again, I really just love the dreadful tone that is out of this fun month here, having all these characters coming to terms with the situation that they're in, and us getting a lot of great interactions here, along with us plus also unlocking Aegis's social link, which is again a very strong one here, again furthering her figuring out her humanity, really highlighting Aegis as probably the character that develops the most throughout this entire journey. Again, by the end of this, essentially feeling human and gaining this purpose to live, not because she was programmed to do so, because she actually genuinely wants to do so. Ultimately, we obviously get to January 31st, the final day of the game. Before the final battle, we do get a final conversation within our group talking about the worry that if they destroy Tartarus, that even if they win, they might lose their memories, and talk about how they're going to have a meetup spot, which is going to be the rooftop of the school on graduation day, which I'm sure isn't foreshadowing. Obviously, to face off against Nyx at the end, we got to get to the top of Tartarus, to where, again, by the end of the 31st, you have to be at the top, where we do start off with our final set of boss battles. First against Jin, who is Jin, and then we get to Takaya, which even that isn't a particularly hard boss, though. Again, he does have an ability that can sap all your SP, which can be annoying. But again, I do love the conversations that are had during these fights, where again, it really just shows the characters having found this reason to fight, having this reason to live, able to rebut all this negativity that stems from Takaya, which again is showing their development there. But ultimately, we get to the final boss of the game against Nyx, which I really love this final boss battle in pretty much every single way. It's really cool visually in the fact that Nyx is really looming over you, coming off extremely intimidating, but also I really love the overall design of this as well. The fact that Nyx has 13 different phases, each representing each of the arcana that he faced off along the way, and shifting his weaknesses and abilities along the way. And again, all this was really cool. I really love how this is handled, especially considering the fact that he also played a remix of the Velvet Room theme along the way, which again, just really awesome final boss. And obviously, I absolutely adored the conclusion of this fight as well. Again, it calling back to all the bonds that we forged along the way. Again, every single social link that we finished ends up being referred to, us seeing their reactions to the fight. Also getting to hear their words of encouragement in the Velvet Room, which leads to the main character being given the power of the universe, which we now use to face off against Nyx alone, using one final attack called Great Seal, which conveniently takes up all of our HP, which I wonder if that will be relevant. But again, a really great conclusion to this fight, and one that I think initially, considering the themes of this story, you could see a world where this is it for the main character. This is the end of his story, that he sacrificed himself to save his friends in this spot. And I think that in itself would have been satisfying. Though something I love about this story is that it goes an extra step here, and that we actually see the main character come back, making you think that, oh, he's going to survive all this. Where we jump forward 2 months to where seemingly everyone has lost their memory, the Tartarus and the Dark Room being erased, but it does lead to us being given a final day where we get to say farewell to all of the social links that we maxed out, which has some incredible moments along the way. Again, us seeing all this development for all these characters, us seeing how the main character has impacted these characters, which again was just so satisfying from that point of view. But also, this entire sequence filled me with dread in the fact that I think it became so clear that the main character was about to die. As again, throughout all this, we get these references to the other characters saying that the main character looks sick and that he should get some rest, which again, very apparent where this story was going, especially considering the themes of the story. To where we see like the main character making plans with these other characters, only for us to know that it's probably not going anywhere. But again, we get some touching farewells, some funny farewells, particularly with Miss Toriumi, obviously, who is Maya in real life. Or again, the fact that she learns that she had been talking to her student is all really funny. But the game ultimately ends the next day, March 5th, graduation day. Obviously, again, this moment that the main character had promised to be a spot where everyone meets up together. Where here we get to see the graduation ceremony with Mitsuru giving this great speech here, obviously, that feels very resonant with her development. Oh, well, it's during the speech where everyone seems to get their memories back, to which they all head for a rooftop as we see the main character in Aegis's arms, with him clearly starting to pass. And we get this great final moment as we have to choose to close our eyes just as the other party members arrive, and us getting a final shot of Aegis looking at them, which I think is all such a perfect ending. And I really love everything that is done here. I do think, again, what happens to the main character, him again using the Great Seal to sacrifice himself for the world, but also again for his friends, all that is very thematically satisfying. Also the fact that the main character survives, the fact that he lives out until March, and clearly in a spot where again he had been living essentially as a husk over the last month just to get to graduation day, this day that they had promised each other to get to, is again also so beautiful. Also for him to die in Aegis's arms here, in a spot where it felt like she kind of becomes his like living will in a way. Again, I think that's all very strong. And I also love the fact that in the final shot is literally her looking at her friends here. Again, all that feels so thematically satisfying satisfying, but also, again, so bittersweet. And the fact that, obviously, again, yes, the main character dies at the end. And I do see some people being confused over that. I do see that, like, people were unsure if the main character died until the answer ends up confirming it, which I do question, like, how, considering it's like, do you not know the themes of the story? Were you not paying attention? As I think it's very apparent the main character has to die, considering the themes of this story. It does not make sense that the main character is just sleeping in this instance. But again, it's just so perfect the way that everything concludes here, with this, again, probably being one of my favorite video game narratives of all time. And especially when, like, connecting it back to themes of the game and how the gameplay ends up complementing that as well. Like, I do feel like so much of this game is handled so purposely and so focused in a way that I end up leaving my experience with Persona 3 feeling like it's near perfection. I do really adore pretty much everything that they do here. I think it really plays off these themes extremely well. Again, showing all these characters getting over their fear of death, showing all these characters finding a purpose to live, and showing the main character really follow through. Again, being told that he's found the answer to life and has been able to make his life mean something. And again, I just think there's so much to take away from in this ending, to where, again, I do truly believe this is one of the best video game stories ever told, and one that doesn't need any follow-up. I think, again, the way that everything concludes in this spot is in this way that you don't really need to know what happens after this. I don't think there's a purpose, as I think you can imply that through the experiences these characters had, that they eventually were able to move on from his death and were able to live rich lives and were able to find the answer to life themselves. So where, again, I don't think we needed more to the story, but then for some reason we got the answer, which, again, I'm not going to talk too extensively about the answer, not that there's that much to really talk about, but I just want to give, like, general opinions on it, in the sense that I really don't know why this exists. I don't feel like there's really a purpose to this. Or again, I do feel like the ending of the base game is just so perfect, and it ends in a way that you don't really need to see exactly what happens, and the answer just feels like them just showing us exactly what happens. And, well, again, I do think there are some decent moments within the answer that do progress certain character arcs. I do feel like as a whole it just felt like an unnecessary extension here, but obviously, again, it revolves around Aegis, with us seeing events about a month after the main character's death, and that the C's members have grown apart and are obviously grieving over the main character's death, and the DLC obviously has them by the end coming to terms with it, which, again, you would expect them to do anyway. But also here we do end up getting a new character, that being Metis, Aegis's sister, which she definitely won't say sister a billion times over the course of this game, but really more so a kind of just plot device / representation of Aegis's grief over the loss of the main character, which makes her feel like a character that, again, doesn't really have much substance. It just feels like she's just kind of there for a lot of the game. But along with her also comes the fact that Aegis just gets the powers of the main character now, I guess, and is now able to use Orpheus and use all these different personas, which leads to a bulk of this game just being dungeon crawling, which is boring, which, I mean, again, is probably more in line with a more traditional RPG, but again, with the Persona series obviously being one that usually has these, like, social link aspects of the game, again, those are completely cut out of this DLC, kind of, at least to any significant degree. I think that is an aspect of it that's very weird, in the sense that despite the fact that we do see the characters mourning over the loss of the main character, and it seems to have grown them apart, we do get additional content added for Reload here that has the characters still being friends and close through all this, which is very weird, especially considering a later moment in the story. But the bulk of this game is really just going through these Tartarus-like sections over and over and over again for what ends up being a 20-hour runtime, which was just so tedious. And again, this was not a fun playthrough 100%. I did play this on stream, and if I was not streaming this, there's no way I would have finished this on my own. I would just give it up and just watch all the cutscenes. And even when streaming it, I did end up just watching all the cutscenes afterwards anyway. But again, I didn't find the gameplay experience of this fun, which, to be fair, is kind of the point. Again, I don't think you're meant to be having fun playing this game, considering, again, it is a game about grief, and I do feel like the tedium of gameplay kind of, again, correlates to the thematic messaging of the game. But again, that doesn't change the fact that it's still a miserable experience playing this game. So I have respect for what this game ends up attempting to do. Again, it still doesn't lead to me actually enjoying the experience of actually playing it. Well, also narratively, again, it just feels so unnecessary. I just did not feel like this is something I needed to see. The characters overcoming their grief and finally moving on after the main character's death, which, again, you should have just implied from the original game. And while I do get the fact that we get, again, like, these individualized moments of seeing each character of our parties, flashbacks, and these like moments that cause their awakenings. It does come off very like fan servicey to me. It just feels like, again, the type of trope of like future installments feeling the need to explain like the minutia of previous moments, where I didn't particularly like that. And I really didn't like a later moment in the story where we end up having to fight our own party members, because I guess the C's members have a disagreement over how to handle this key that can change the main character's fate, which I really hate even the slightest mention of potentially bringing back the main character. But anyway, it leads to a series of boss battles against our own party members, which is weird in itself, especially considering, again, the disjointed nature of the fact that we were like very friendly with our fellow party members not long before that, to where the fact that now we have this big disagreement that causes us to fight each other to the death is all really strange. But also, it doesn't even really make sense. Like, why are Aigis and Midas fighting against Sanada and Ken, who essentially just want to do the same thing? Also, why is Yukari and Mitsuru deciding to go against the rest of the team, especially in the spot where like Yukari at least like has a reason of her wanting to bring the main character back. Now, again, I would ideally not like that to be more in conjunction with the events of the main story, though. Again, I think you can at least like rationalize where she's coming from. Mitsuru's is just ridiculous. Like, why is she doing this? Like, she simply just wants to do this because Yukari is, and now they're best friends, I guess. All that was so stupid. Though I will say, I did feel like this scene culminates in a really strong way, with Yukari having this really emotional speech. They're finally coming to terms with the main character's death, which again I thought was a nice moment there. But realistically, again, I just felt like the entire situation was pretty ridiculous. And I feel like the final boss battle here was a little bit underwhelming as well, where it just felt like a pretty standard boss battle, just against a damage sponge. But it culminates in them breaking the time loop. And the reveal that Metis was, again, just this representation of Aigis' rejected human emotion. And also, I do kind of like an aspect of Mia's character, and the fact that she is obviously showing this like kind of starting point for Aigis and showing how far Aigis has gone. But again, really, I don't feel like that's much. We have Aigis embracing her humanity, and the characters accepting the main character's death after they had learned that he sacrificed himself for the world, which I think is also kind of dumb, where it very much feels like the only reason that they do end up accepting his death is because he sacrificed himself, where otherwise they would have went back in time and tried to save him, which I think is also really strange. And again, I do feel like there are definitely aspects of this story that do feel like a retcon. And in general, again, I don't particularly like the answer. I think as a gameplay experience is against a pretty dreadful one. I think as a narrative, I think there are good moments here and there, but I think it's also surrounded by a lot of contrivances and just things that just simply didn't need to be there. And really, that's just the main thought I have with this DLC, is the fact that I just feel like it's unnecessary. I feel like it does not enhance the ending of the original game at all. If anything, it takes away from it. And at that point, it's like, what was the point outside of, again, making money? But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Persona 3 Reload. Again, a bigger video than I was hoping it would be. But again, I really did adore this game. I do think this game like instantly jumps up to one of my favorite games of all time. I think it really takes what I got from my experience with Persona 5, but then just adds so much more to it, despite the fact that the game is actually, again, like watered down in certain aspects. But again, I think more focused, and I think tells a much deeper and richer story. Where again, I truly do have this game amongst the best of the best games ever made. Or again, I already had Persona 5 like easily as one of my favorite games of all time. I think this is better. I think this is a game that excels upon that in almost every single facet, to where I'm excited to play more Persona down the road. Obviously, Persona 6 is coming eventually. Persona 4 is a game that I have not played in its entirety, or really beyond the first few hours. Again, I would love to experience that for the first time, make a video on that. I also would like to make a video on Metaphor. But again, I'm very interested in playing more of these style of games, making more videos like this, and talking about my opinions on these games along the way. But with that, again, those are my thoughts on Persona 3 Reload. Thank you for watching.